Hi, my name is Thais Gibson, and I am the owner and co-creator of the Personal Development School. This is your daily breakthrough video, and today I'm going to do something a lot different from the average video. So in this video, I'm going to actually go through and answer a whole bunch of questions I have from members in the Members Lounge inside of the Personal Development School, because not only are these great questions, but I think there are a lot of frequently asked questions. And instead of making sort of these short form videos where or sort of answering these questions in short forms, I wanted to be able to go through and give a lot of these questions the care that they deserve, because a lot of them are really wonderful questions. So first and foremost, I'm going to start with Shannon's question. So Shannon says, "Hi Thais, I'm an FA right now and working on myself. Is it possible that an FA would move through a DA phase on the path to becoming more secure? I feel like I am healing, but I don't want to deal with a relationship anymore. Thank you, Shannon." So first and foremost, this is a really commonly asked question that I get. And here's what happens. So we know the FAs, the fearful avoidants, they have the ability to sort of access both sides of the attachment spectrum. And sometimes you'll hear fearful avoidance referred to as anxious avoidance. It's actually probably the most appropriate name. I historically learned about attachment styles in a way that learned the term fearful avoidance, so it's something I'm very familiar with under those pretenses. But you'll hear fearful avoidance also sometimes called disorganized attachment style, and this is referring to that they don't tend to have a consistent order or organizational sort of schema for how they attach to others. Sometimes they want the anxious side, they crave connection, and other times they really need to avoid it and they feel unsafe, and other times they just don't trust and they're sort of ambivalent and somewhere in between. And so what this is referring to is it's basically the programming, the set of patterns or conditions that the fearful avoidant / disorganized / anxious avoidant received in childhood. So let's say that the fearful avoidant had an attachment figure that was also very unpredictable. Sometimes they were warm and loving, sometimes they were cold and scary and mean. And so there's never like a cause and effect that's clear. There's never a pattern that's clear. It's not like, hey, if you break this rule, you get in trouble, and the action and consequence form a pattern that can be learned and understood and adapted to. But instead, it's sort of like, if this person's in a bad mood, if this person's having a bad day, if this person's struggling with something, if they have anger issues, and other times it's like, wow, this person's in a wonderful mood. They're so warm and loving and kind. So because there's no direct cause and effect, because there aren't a certain set of rules that you learn to follow in terms of how you attach, what happens is the fearful avoidant, when they're a child, they don't have this learned pattern, so they don't get an attachment strategy developed. And so this is why we'll sometimes hear disorganized attachment, because there's no organization to their strategy for attachment. And this is also sometimes why you'll hear anxious avoidant, because sometimes you'll see this individual on the anxious side, sometimes on the avoidant side. Now, the most commonly used term a lot of the times is fearful avoidant, but it's just another terminology for those other forms of attachment, for the same form of attachment style being described in those three different ways. So going back to Shannon's question, what happens is that as the fearful avoidant, who is largely out of relationship to themselves their whole lives, they've learned to become hypervigilant, hyper-focused on how other people respond to them, hyper-focused on how they can sort of be safe in this way when they attach to others, when it feels very unsafe and inconsistent and scary and confusing. So with all of these things combined, what happens is the fearful avoidant just learns to be hyper-focused on everybody outside of them. And this is at the sort of detriment to the relationship to oneself. So here comes the fearful avoidant, super connected to everybody else's patterns, trying to notice whatever they can, hyper-vigilant, shifts, changes in tone, body expression, micro-expression, body language, all of this stuff. And they are disconnected from themselves in the process. And so a lot of fearful avoidants are hyper empathizers. They feel a lot for other people. They notice a lot of sort of distinctions, shifts in patterns, all these sorts of things. What they're not noticing is a lot of their own feelings and needs. And this is also part of the reason why fearful avoidance can be so codependent. And so as a result, what can take place is when the fearful avoidant finally realizes that they need to be in relationship to themselves, when they finally realize like, hey, I have a relationship to myself and it's valid and I need to actually connect there, sometimes they feel and they seem as though they are moving into the side of attachment where they're suddenly not responsible for everybody else around them. They're actually connecting to themselves. And because the brain has a homeostatic impulse, because the brain wants and seeks equilibrium, wherever it perceives something to be missing, it seeks to fulfill it, and it goes into sort of overdrive to fulfill it as this compensating factor. Just like if the brain feels like it's hungry or thirsty for prolonged periods of time, it might overeat and try to compensate for that, or drink so much water that your stomach hurts all of a sudden. These sorts of things can take place because there's that need to compensate for what we perceive to be missing. So what happens with a fearful avoidant is they can go from being like so connected and so in touch with everybody else around them, and then all of a sudden they realize, whoa, I can take care of my own feelings and needs, I can feel my own feelings and needs, and they go into more of their avoidant side of their attachment style. It's not even that they're becoming avoidant, it's that they're just trying to equilibrate for being out of relationship to themselves for so long. So it's not necessarily that they don't want people to be near them and they want everybody to bugger off. It's just that they're very hyper focused on themselves for the first time, because the brain is equilibrating from being so hyper vigilant about everybody else and now wanting to be in connection to oneself. So I just thought this was a really important question, and it's very normal for fearful avoidants when they start healing and connecting to themselves. I see them go through chapters of taking space from relationships, taking space from other people. And because a lot of fearful avoidants, not all, but it is a pattern, that quite a few fearful avoidants can be sort of in this space where they super connect to other people as a means of sort of deriving some sort of self-identity. Fearful avoidants can be quite codependent because of the way that their attachment style gets activated. That sometimes they'll feel like it's strange that they're not deriving their identity from other people. Sometimes they'll feel like, whoa, this is weird that I want to be alone. This has never happened. And so they'll judge it as fearful avoidant, when in reality it might just be a healthy chapter of life where they're reigniting that self-connection. So it's not something to be concerned about. It's actually a good sign of healing for a lot of fearful avoidants. Now, if this is connected and suddenly there's all this fear, like, oh my gosh, I'm afraid to be in a relationship, everybody get away. If there's a lot of fear, then you want to work on the fear and the stories that exist. What are your stories that you're holding on to about relationships that's causing you to fear and avoid them? And that's a different sort of thing. But if it's just a disinterest or an indifference or a need to sort of focus on oneself and for that not to be interrupted, these are healthy signs for the vast majority of fearful avoidance. And you'll see yourself evolve through that. Like once you feel like your brain's equilibrated that void a little bit, it might be a year, or for people even 2 years at times. But what you're doing is you're setting the foundation within yourself to go into a relationship and actually have a really healthy relationship, because you're rooted in yourself. You know who you are. You have a strong sense of self-identity. You know your feelings, your needs. You can express them. And these are basically prerequisites to relationship health. So another really wonderful question here is from Kelly. And Kelly's got a lot of great questions and participation in here, as does Shannon. She says, hello, amazingly brave PDS colleagues. I'd appreciate some advice on how to not take responsibility for another person's feelings. Okay. Examples on how you all handled the situation and stayed with your own feelings. Okay. So then Kelly goes on to share some of her own story and a couple of examples that I won't go through here. But I want to just go through these questions specifically. Advice on how to not take responsibility for another person's feelings. Okay. So, number one, the actual taking responsibility for another person's feelings is very much related to codependency. Okay. A lot of us get trained to be codependent, and this can be directly or indirectly. This can be because our parents are also codependent, and they were trained to love and care for children in the same way that they were loved and cared for, which was also in an enmeshed way. And this can also be because there's an addict in the family. There's, somebody who's going through a tremendous amount of depression, somebody who is a very strict and controlling parent and is basically training directly or indirectly for children to be enmeshed and codependent in the first place. So I actually have an entire codependency and enmeshment course coming out in 2 weeks. And it's like one of my favorite courses I've written so far. It's really, really great. It's about different steps to breaking codependency, and understanding what the core beliefs are. And we go through basically 7 core steps that include like taking inventory of all the places in your life where you express codependency, noticing where you don't set boundaries in all 7 areas of life, and then basically taking your learnings out of there and reprogramming through different reprogramming tools, some of these patterns that exist in the same form. So what I will say, because I can't obviously go through the whole course and all the steps here, what I will say is that there are different boundaries that we have to set. There are boundaries that are feeling boundaries. There are boundaries that are mental or intellectual boundaries. So the boundaries around your own opinions, your beliefs, your thoughts that you are entitled to as an individual. And when we talk about feeling or emotional boundaries, it's, you know, where your emotions end and somebody else's begin, and not taking responsibility for somebody else's feelings, not taking them on as if they are yours, and then trying to adapt. And then we also have physical boundaries, material boundaries, and sexual boundaries. And when our boundaries are infringed upon or violated, either because somebody else is doing that to us and we're not standing up, or because we're actually doing it to ourselves, like taking on somebody else's feelings without them even asking, and it's an internal process that we're enacting, there is a violation to ourselves, and we lose a little bit of self-trust, and it's a form of self-betrayal and self-abandonment when we do that, because we become, you know, over there doing somebody else's life, and we're not here connected to ourselves in that moment. And this can be pervasive for some people. So what we want to be able to do is start practicing these different boundary forms. And there's a really great set of tools and steps we have for doing this inside the school, but just some really important places to get started right now, in sort of a high-level short form version, is you want to think of an emotional boundary. Like when we talk about Kelly's question, not taking responsibility for other people's feelings, we want to think of this as this program that actually served us at one period of time to feel safe and adapt to our environment and sort of make it through, but might no longer be serving us. And here's why. Number one, often when we're taking other people's feelings on, it really wounds us. We really, especially those of us who are hyper empathizers, we really feel those feelings as if as if they are ours. And when we're doing this, when we're trying to solve problems and we're in pain and we're triggered and we're in fight or flight mode, we don't have as much activity in our neocortex. We're not as good at being logical, rational, working through things, coming up with the best possible solutions, because we're in fight or flight mode. And this is sometimes where we can make those, you know, emotional decisions, those fear-based decisions. We're not actually considering all possibilities. We're not thinking as clearly. And so I want you to imagine that you have a close person to you and you take on their problem. And now one person was in pain and now 2 people are in pain trying to solve a problem. And so usually when 2 people are in pain trying to solve, it's like 2 wounded people trying to fix a wound. It's better to have one wounded person and somebody else who's has a little bit of healthy emotional separation or healthy boundaries, who can then come in and actually be present, be non-triggered, and think clearly and provide a really unique objective point of view. And this can be very important. So number one, we lose that when we take on other people's feelings. And number 2, there's a beautiful quote that I love that I read in a book years ago, and these aren't exactly the words, but it was something along the lines of, how can I be fully present enough to help anybody when I'm too busy projecting what their suffering must feel like? And I remember reading this and being like, wow, that's really profound. And what it's saying, what this quote is saying, is that when you're in suffering and I'm over empathizing, if I'm taking on your feelings like they're mine, there's not a healthy amount of empathy with a nice boundary in between. What's actually happening is I'm telling a story in my mind, in my imagination, about your story, and then I'm actually suffering over my own version of your story. And what we also know from a psychological perspective is that we tend to empathize the most in an unhealthy way and in an enmeshed way when people are telling a story that touches, in our ideas about the story, wounds that are actually unresolved inside of ourselves. So sometimes we tell a story about somebody else's pain and it actually triggers us, and we start suffering over our own wounds in a way. So I want to become conscious about this, because we lose our ability to fully be present, to be there, and to help somebody in the highest expression of ourselves, with our logical thinking mind turned fully on, and our ability to not personalize somebody else's story and make it a little bit about us at a subconscious level. And so we lose our ability to be that present when we're taking on other people's feelings. So we want to be able to practice, okay, a healthy amount of separation. And at first it's going to feel strange. Why? Because when you were a child, if you were raised in an enmeshed home, your brain made an adaptation to its circumstances and went, oh, I have to take on other people's feelings or become hypervigilant about what people are feeling so I can sort of empathize and connect and get my needs met in some form. So whether it was for safety, whether it was for love and connection, whether it was just to understand what was going on in your environment and feel a sense of certainty, it helped you at a point in time to over-empathize, to not have boundaries. And so that was a strategy to adapt to your environment. And whenever we have a programmed strategy in our subconscious mind that's there to keep us safe or feel certain or to get us to get our needs met for love and connection or attunement, closeness, right? What takes place is when we try to recondition that pattern, a lot of those biological mechanisms inside of us are going to go, no, you can't do that. You have to take on that person's feelings. You're bad if you don't. You're selfish. You might lose love and connection. You could be abandoned. You might become unsafe. You could feel alone again like you did as a child. So all of this fear and shame when we're breaking these patterns is very likely to come up. And what we have to do for ourselves is be able to feel the fear and shame and still go through exposure response repatterning as one example, still make changes anyways. And so in doing that, we allow ourselves to start developing healthy boundaries. And without healthy boundaries in a relationship, we will always harbor resentment. We will always feel unseen, unheard, disconnected from ourselves. We will reject and betray the relationship to ourselves to please others, and that will feel frustrating. And we will feel frustrated and often project that onto another person. We will feel like our needs and our feelings are not worthy of being communicated. We will feel unsafe as a result of that. There are so many, the list goes on and on and on. But if we don't have healthy boundaries on all levels, feeling boundaries or emotional boundaries, intellectual boundaries by honoring our own opinions if they differ from others, as one of many examples, physical boundaries with our actual physical space or our body, sexual boundaries with our sexual desires and interests, and material boundaries with our things. Like, can everybody just take your car and use it for the day? Do they have to ask? Do you have a hard boundary around that? These different categories, if we are not showing up for them, we will suffer long term. So the only way to really shift this is through repatterning. There's so many different ways we can do this, but one of the first most important ones is we know that the subconscious mind is always programmed or reprogrammed through repetition plus emotion. So we want to repetitively be able to tell ourselves, that is not mine. I have to trust that that person can deal with that. I'm going to ask them if they need my support, and I can say, hey, I'm here. What do you need? And I can ask them if they need something from me. And then I can assess inside of myself, can I do this or not? Am I available to do this or not? The amount of time I have to do this or not. And that's a wonderful thing. Because then we're in connection to ourselves at the same time as we're connecting to somebody else. And then the decisions we make or the things we do are based on mutual benefits and respect instead of based on self-sacrifice, which will always come up in an uglier way later as frustration, resentment, or expectation for somebody else to do for us what we did for them. And these are not healthy exchanges. So we want to be people respecters, not people pleasers, okay? We want to be able to have these healthy conversations without it being a form of self-denial. So I probably answered that question for a very long time, but it was a great question. And I just wanted to share that in here. So another question we have here is, I'm actually going to go through a couple more. I know this will be a bit of a long form video, but I think it's sort of fun that way because it allows us to have different conversations and sort of go through a whole bunch of different things. I noticed somebody in the group, Rob, saying, I decided to spend the day with me. I'm going to the theater to watch a movie alone and grab something to eat, learning to be comfortable with me. I just thought that was beautiful. So here's another question. So from Rob, I, as an anxiously attached person, noticed this pattern years ago where I would look forward to coming home from each day to see my wife, who's fearful avoidant. However, as soon as I would walk in the door to see this person, my mood would change from okay to sad or angry. I used to think it was because my house was a safe place where I could be by myself and sort of express my emotions, I think he's saying. But now I'm starting to wonder if this was due to attachment-related connection issues. Anyone else experience this? This is a wonderful question. And so what I find in this situation is that for a whole bunch of different individuals, when they feel like they're entering into a connection or a closeness to somebody, it could be that they carry unconscious expectations while going into the home. And while they might not realize it, they might have this idea of, oh my gosh, I want all this closeness, but there might be, then they walk in and then the person doesn't greet them in the way that they hoped, or doesn't stand up and be super kind to them in a specific form, or their mind thinks up this connection, how beautiful it will be, and then the reality compared to that subconscious fantasy is a little more painful. It's, oh yeah, we are actually a little bit less connected, and I forgot about that, and hey, we've been disconnecting a little bit over the past few years, and I forgot. And so sometimes the fantasy, and a lot of anxiously attached individuals can be in the fantasy mind a little bit. They derive, remember, our brain derives its needs from the present moment, from things that are actually going on, and its fantasies about the future, and its memories from the past, and the nostalgic sort of connections we place there. So if we're not getting our needs met fully in the present moment, sometimes the brain will fantasize, or it will become nostalgic and remember, and those memories or the future fantasies elicit emotional responses, which actually, because the brain doesn't tell that well between what's visualized and what's imagined, what this can do is it can sort of give this feeling of like, ooh, this feels so good. My needs are being met emotionally through these memories or these fantasies. And so the anxious mind is more likely to do that. And then you might come into reality and feel that juxtaposition of what I expected versus what is actually going on. And so that can take place as well. And it was an absolutely great question. So another wonderful question in here. It's so cute. All these people share these amazing things in here. So another question is, I won't say names. I was going to say just first names, but just in case, I'm going to share just names. I know people are posting these publicly, but just to be extra careful. So somebody else says, hey guys, I have a few questions for DAs. One of my best male friends is a DA, and I'm an AA, so dismissive, avoidant, anxiously attached. As a friend, he is open, he communicates, he's always there for me. We tried to be more than friends a few times in the last year and a half, but every time things got physical, he would shut down and run, or worse, he would hurt me in passive-aggressive ways, which I later realized that I instigated in passive-aggressive ways as well. Each time it happened, it took several months to repair the damage and get back to a good place. I don't want to go through that again, and I've realized the only way to love him is from a safe distance, but it's hard on me because my primary love language is physical touch, and I find myself always wanting to touch him. It's almost painful not to touch him. So here's my question for the DAs. Number one, do you think any physical touch is going to make him run? What do you think is safe? Hugging, cuddling, kissing, or do DAs hate all of it? We are both single now, and I've joked around with my friend and told him to come over and cuddle with me or make out, but then I wonder if it's actually asking him to do something painful for him. So I'm going to pause right there. So what's really interesting is that it's not so much that okay, so sometimes DAs feel a little bit unsafe around physical touch because they can be very intense with their physical boundaries. You know how we were talking about boundaries earlier? They like their space boundaries, their physical body boundaries. They tend to feel safety in having that boundary around themselves. And they also tend to find like a sense of certainty and control within that. So sometimes violating that not intentionally or like in a bad way, but just sometimes because a lot of other individuals don't have such extreme physical space boundaries, and we tend to project from our perception. We're like, oh, I would love a hug. So, you want to hug, or you want to get close, or you want to do all these different things. So sometimes that space can create that safety for this individual. And then when it's infringed upon, it can make them feel sort of triggered because they perceive it at a subconscious level as their certainty or control being taken. So these can be points. But also, sometimes dismissive avoidants are also amazing friends because they feel more safe and secure in friendships. And then they tend to avoid the emotional parts of the relationships because they tend to associate emotions with vulnerability, and vulnerability as a treacherous thing. Not to be over dramatic, but just they tend to associate vulnerability as being very scary and very triggering. So imagine it's like you go from safe zone to now, if you want something physical or something that could spark a romantic or emotional connection in a vulnerable way, that's what can be really triggering. And that's where the arms go up, right? It's like, oh, we went from this place to now this place, and that's something that can be triggering and scary for them. Is it triggers that feeling of vulnerability. So dismissive avoidants don't necessarily hate in any way all sort of physical touch and stuff like that. They tend to be really careful about their boundaries. They tend to need a lot more physical space than the average person because of early associations from childhood. And really, the more safe and the more slow moving you are towards physical touch, the more they start to open up. And this is something that can change over time. Also, I haven't looked at my computer screen, but I know that the light's coming in and out. So I apologize if it's like bright, dark, bright, dark. It's a sunny day here. So I would get up and close the blinds, but I think I might as well keep going with the video because I want to answer a couple more questions. So these are great questions. Another question here is from the same person. How can I make him feel loved and safe? I heard that most DA's love language is words of affirmation. Is this how he receives love or how he gives love? Great question. So your love language is usually how you both give and receive love. So that's an important point to note. And dismissive ones are usually words of affirmation, but also acts of service and sometimes gifts as well, but more the females than the males. So you want to just sort of keep in that space, right? Just be consistent in that space. Slowly open conversations about asking those questions. Everybody always feels better when there's a consent piece. And I know that sounds funny in this context, like a consent to, hug somebody or consent to, you don't have to say, hey, can I hug you? But you might just have a conversation ahead of time that says something like, hey, how do you feel about physical affection? Like, what are your boundaries? So I can understand them, because I notice that my love language is very much physical touch, and I notice that that's not really yours. And so I just want to make sure I'm respectful of that. Where do you stand? Like, what do you like and not like? And what goes on inside of you? What does that feel like? Like, you can just open this dialogue in kind of like a curious, inquisitive, deep conversation way. I would never go like, oh, hey, can I hug you? Because it sort of puts somebody on the spot, but open a conversation about it in a time where you're not planning to hug a person or cuddle or kiss or, ask the person where they stand and what they feel. Dismissive avoidants generally really appreciate that and feel safer because they feel like that's noticed and seen and heard and understood. So the last part of this question was, do you think the fact that he runs away every time we get physical means that he cares? I feel like he didn't care about me, that I wouldn't be a threat to him and he'd be over here all the time. But then again, maybe that's just the AA in me, only seeing what I want to see. And so the answer to that is that it can go both ways. Sometimes an individual feels when there's something physical, like, oh my gosh, this is threatening and it is scary, and they can get confused in that space. And sometimes the more they care, the more threatened they feel, and then the more they need to push away. But other times it can obviously just be somebody who's like, hey, I just want to have a friendship. So I would gently bring that up at a point in time. It sounds like you've been friends for a long time. And so if that's the case, if you already have this sort of relationship, I would just ask about boundaries and maybe inquire gently and even a little bit indirectly where the person's sort of at in their openness to that sort of thing, and then go from there. So great question. Here's another really good one. So another wonderful one in here is, I'm wondering how I'm just going to read it. I'm wondering how I may have handled things differently with my DA last night. He opened up a little bit and said he felt like he was in a funk and going through a midlife crisis. He said every day he feels the same route to work, the same pay, and same bills and an amount left over. I say that maybe we could try changing his scenery and getting out more. And then, this person goes on to basically, the dismissive avoidant sort of sharply cuts her off and said, I shouldn't have brought this up, and sort of gets frustrated. And then this wonderful individual is like, oh my gosh, I should have handled this better. Should I have first asked if he wanted my advice before giving it? I was trying to be helpful, and I realized I might have crossed his boundaries, but it's difficult to talk at an emotional level. So this is something I see all the time. It's very often that I see an anxious or a fearful avoidant or even secure person go to their partner when they say, oh my gosh, I'm not feeling great, their dismissive avoidant partner, specifically in this case, and then their dismissive avoidant partner saying something like, don't talk to me about this, or get away, I'm not going to talk about this again. Now what's happening is that the dismissive avoidant doesn't like change very much as a general rule. They tend to have a very high need for security because they tended to feel like they didn't get a lot of security growing up. So what can take place is they say something, especially in this case, it's like the midlife crisis, and I feel like everything's the same. Security, right? Subconscious mind designing sameness at a subconscious level for prolonged periods of time. And then when somebody suggests making change, it threatens one of their highest personality needs, which is their very strong need for security, safety, predictability, certainty, right? So now that's being pushed on by this person, and the dismissive avoidant is reacting. And this is common. So one of the best things to do, and this goes for men and women, is, a lot of us don't tend to love. We often want to be seen and heard and understood, and we want our emotions to be validated and connected to, but we don't necessarily want advice a lot of the time. I think that's pretty true across many attachment styles, whether they're consciously aware of it or not. But these are very, of course, we were like, we want to help, and it's you're showing up. You didn't really do anything wrong, this person who's asking this question. So what I recommend is that you validate somebody's feelings first. Whenever, this goes for everybody, whenever somebody tells you something and says, hey, I'm in pain, validate their emotions first, and then ask them, what do you need from me, or what can I support you in doing? And that opens the dialogue in a way that allows that person to not have any potential to be triggered because it's coming from them. And when you validate somebody's feelings, they feel heard because they feel like you connected to the emotional part of them that's governing in those moments when they are feeling triggered. So you see it, you hear it, you understand it, you said that to them. Oh, I see why you would feel like you're in a funk. I see that would feel very routine and monotonous over time, and I see that might be frustrating. I'm sorry you're going through that. What do you need from me? Or what can I do to help you in this situation? Is there anything? Or do you just want me to listen? Like, you can sort of open the dialogue in that way. So I would always advise following those steps. Step 1, validating their emotions. Step 2, asking what they need so that they still feel like that control is in their hands, sort of thing. And you basically prevent that trigger from taking place, especially for the dismissive avoidant, of them feeling like, this is too much. You're trying to ask me to change my needs for certainty and security. So I wanted to touch on that because that's a wonderful question too. I'm going to go through this last question. It says, question for DA with children. Do you find that you are more affectionate towards your kids than your partner? And why is this? So I'm going to make sort of a joke, but not in a mean way. I have had so many partners of dismissive avoidance over the years, so many, say to me, my husband or my wife, she's so much more affectionate with the dog than she is with me. She's so affectionate with the friggin' dog or the cat. And like, hello, like, she definitely loves the cat or dog more than me. I hear this all the time. So it's kind of funny in one sense because it's like, that's not a nice problem to have as the partner, obviously. However, when you understand it, it really depersonalizes it. So what takes place here is that when there's an individual who is feeling this way, right? The dismissive avoidant is able to be more affectionate to the dog or to the children. This happens a lot as well with children. It's not always the case, but I would say the vast majority of the time it is. What's happened is the dismissive avoidant doesn't have any subconsciously stored associations to fear of vulnerability to a dog or to a baby, because babies and dogs are like two of the most vulnerable things that exist, or pets in general. So they're so vulnerable that there's no threat or fear perceived at a subconscious level, whereas emotional closeness between a human being and another human being can trigger stored associations from childhood of feeling vulnerable, unseen, unheard, misunderstood, all those sorts of things. So this can be where that disconnect comes into place. And this can be where some of those triggers come up. And then, of course, it's easier at a subconscious level based on their programs for the dismissive avoidant to be more vulnerable, to be more connected to something that is the epitome of vulnerability and poses no emotional threat to that individual. So it's a great question. It's something I see all the time. And it's really an important thing to recognize so that you can depersonalize it. Okay, so that is that. These are a whole bunch of wonderful questions. There's a whole bunch more, but what I'm going to start doing is, because there's so many great questions in here that I think should be answered with a lot of care, and just questions that I'm sure so many other people are wondering as a whole. I just want to go through, and I'm going to start making videos that also just go through and answer, sort of rapid fire answer these questions. I don't really read them ahead of time. I sort of read them out loud. So there will be times where I'm like reading and I'm like, ooh, this may not be the right question, or whatever it might be. But I just wanted to be able to share this with everybody out here. And thank you guys inside the school as well for everybody who's putting these amazing questions out for everybody in general to learn and grow and share experiences. And thank you everybody here for liking, for sharing, for subscribing, for being a part of this wonderful community. And I will see you in the next video.